Hey biology guys, it's been a while since we did an online video, but since I'm going to be out, this is how you're going to need to get the presentation. You are going to highlight along with this video, and before the substitute gives you your actual note paper, you're going to have to show him or her that you have highlighted the appropriate parts of your notes that go along with this video. Please don't skip parts of it. You definitely need to watch all of it so that you get everything that you need in order to fill in your notes on time. This presentation is going to be on natural selection and how natural selection changes the adaptations in populations. So we talked a little bit about natural selection when we were in class last time, and we talked about how populations naturally have some genetic diversity, and we talked about the concept of survival of the fittest. Now we need to kind of dig into that just a little bit more. So just to refresh your memory, the process of organisms with the best adaptations surviving to reproduce and to pass on their genes is known as natural selection. You need to highlight everything on this slide. That entire definition is on your notes. Natural selection occurs because environmental resources, both biotic and abiotic, are limited. And if you remember, we talked about biotic and abiotic resources. Biotic, of course, means living, and abiotic means non-living. Organisms that can acquire these resources the best are most likely to survive and reproduce. And there's those special words again that you're going to hear about 8 million times more. Survival and reproduction is kind of the goal of organisms. So if you have some traits that help you acquire resources, you're going to be able to do those two important things. So as far as highlighting on this one, you're going to highlight the first sentence. Natural selection occurs because environmental resources, both biotic and abiotic, are limited. And what are the two things that organisms need to do? They need to, number one, survive, and number two, reproduce. That's also you need to highlight the words survive and reproduce. When organisms have traits that help them acquire resources and reproduce, we say they're well adapted to their environment. An adaptation is a trait that helps an organism survive and reproduce. So I'm underlining the sentence that you need to highlight on your notes. So take a look at this picture right here. This is obviously a tiger. The tiger's long, sharp fangs allow the tiger to catch and kill large prey more easily. This is actually called a leaf insect. They are well camouflaged to avoid being eaten by predators, and the shape of this bird's beak tells us that it can crack open seeds. It is a seed-eating type of bird. Different versions of a gene are called alleles. This is like the 8 millionth time you've heard that. You're going to highlight that part. And alleles make organisms more adapted to their environment. New alleles are created only randomly through mutations. So everything that I'm underlining, you are highlighting. So again, this idea of random mutations is really important. It's not like an organism can go and say, oh, hey, my environment is changing and I'm going to need to grow longer fur, and then just decide to do that. It's the organisms that already have slightly longer fur due to random mutations that are going to be better adapted when a climate changes. Only mutations that occur in gamete cells are passed on to the organism's offspring. And this is actually super important. This is a STAR-tested question, a STAR-tested idea, and you will have one of those questions on the STAR. So I want you to highlight gamete cells that I just circled along there, and I want you to underline the part about mutations occurring in gamete cells being passed on. It does not matter if you've got mutations in other areas of your body. If those mutations do not occur in your gamete cells, they will not be passed on. If a new allele helps an organism to survive longer and to reproduce more offspring, then the frequency of the allele will increase in the population. Here's what you're highlighting on this slide. All right, so this is what this is saying is if the mutation that causes the new allele is beneficial, then it will persist in the population, meaning it's helping the organisms that have that mutation. Something's helping them survive and reproduce. Well, if they're the ones that are surviving and reproducing, then the frequency of that mutation, which is creating that new allele, is going to increase within the population. I want you to take a look at this picture right down here. This is an example that I gave you guys just like, kind of randomly during class a couple of days ago. So we've got a hawk and he's preying on mice that are in a field. And you can see that the field is kind of a grayish type of field. So if you look at month 1, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 white mice and 1, 2, 3, 4 gray mice. And the hawk is swooping down and he's eating mice. Well, in month 2, you see that you now only have 2 white mice and you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 gray mice. So why are the gray mice surviving and the white mice not surviving? Well, you can come up with an idea based on what's happening there. The background, the field itself is gray, and the gray mice are better camouflaged than the white ones. So the bird is able to see the white ones better, and he's picking them up and eating them because he can see them better. Then over time, here's month 3, we end up with just 1 white mouse, and the majority are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 now are gray. And that is because the gray ones are more difficult for the hawk to see. So the gray allele is going to become more frequent in the population because it's better adapted to the environment. The allele frequency will keep increasing in future generations until most of the population has the allele and has the new adaptation. Key idea right here, natural selection changes populations, not individuals. Individuals don't evolve. Individuals are born with the DNA they've got. Populations can change because one or more individuals develop mutations, and those mutations get passed on to their offspring. Changes in the climate or migrating to a new environment can direct natural selection. You're gonna highlight that. So those are 2 things that can direct natural selection: changes to the climate or migrating to a new environment. Species must adapt to the new conditions, and if they cannot adapt, they are going to go extinct. So basically, they're going to adapt or they're going to die. If you look at the picture down here, this is temperature of planet Earth. The temperature has gone up and down, but when organisms that are adapted to one temperature, when the temperature changes on the planet, then we end up with extinctions because those animals cannot adapt. This is one of the reasons that we don't have woolly mammoths running around, and we talked about that. There was climate change. Okay, the peppered moth, which is Biston betullaria, that's its genus and species name, is an insect that lives in Britain and Ireland. A mutation caused some of the moths, which are normally this color, this is the normal color, okay, caused some of the moths to be completely black instead of the peppered version. So this is the mutated version. I'm going to just put mutant. I think that sounds better. Mutant. So the normal ones are this peppery color. That's why they're called pepper moths. And the mutants are this solid black color. And that's just, it was a random mutation. So everybody with me so far? Random mutation. This is the normal. This is the mutant. Okay, stick with me. So originally, the mutation caused the black moths to be eaten more rapidly. And here's why. The trees in the area in Britain that they lived on contained an organism on the surface of the bark called a lichen. You've heard the word lichen before. Lichens are pioneer species. In this case, the lichen's living on the bark of the tree. The peppered moth blends in. There's a peppered moth right here. The peppered moth blends in very, very well with the lichens on the trees. He's very well camouflaged. And the dark black ones could be seen more easily by birds, and so they were eaten more easily because they were more readily because they were seen more easily by the birds. Okay, so in the normal conditions, the peppered moth, this is the normal one, was better adapted to their environment. Peppered moth on the trees that have the lichen, they can't be seen, so they're better adapted. Okay, again, stick with me. But then there was an environmental change. So the Industrial Revolution was a historical event that created large amounts of pollution. The pollution killed the lichens that were growing on the trees. Look at this tree over here. See, there's bare bark. You don't see the lichen there anymore. The lichens are what this normal moth was being camouflaged with. So now this normal peppered colored moth, right, it no longer has camouflage anymore because the lichens are dead because there was an environmental change. Now the darker moths blend in better with the dark bark of the tree, and so the birds are now eating this normal organism rather than the dark mutated organism. So there was an environmental change which caused the normal allele to now be less well adapted to the environment. So now the frequency of the black allele in the population is going to go up because it is now better camouflaged. And the frequency of the peppered allele in the population is going to go down because of the environmental change. Over time, the frequency of the allele for the dark color increased. And here you can see that right there on the graph. Here it is. And the population became mostly dark instead of mostly peppered. And you can see this is the line right here for the peppered color. So the peppered color went down and the dark color went up. The individuals didn't change their color, but the population overall became darker because the predator couldn't see the dark ones on the trees that no longer had the lichens on them. So there was an environmental change which caused the first allele to no longer be as well adapted to the environment. This also illustrates the importance of diversity. When a population contains variations of a gene, it's more likely to adapt to new conditions. Okay, that's an important idea. The more variations in a population, the better they are to adapt to new conditions. So the dark color at the first, during the original conditions, was not beneficial, but eventually the dark color actually helped the species to survive. So genetic diversity amongst a population is very, very important to natural selection. Okay, so let's talk about resistance to pesticides. First, pesticides, of course, everybody knows when you have a bug, an insect in a place that you don't want it, usually in your house or on in your garden or something, you can spray that bug with a chemical that we call a pesticide in order to kill it. When a pesticide is used, most of the insects are killed. However, some insects naturally have genes or alleles that help them survive. So let's take a look at this picture right here with the leaves and the bugs. So here's a farmer, and you can see, look at all the protective gear he's wearing, right? You know, pesticides are pretty toxic, and we talked about biomagnification, and we're going to talk about that again. You got to be careful with them because concentrated, they're quite harmful to health. All right, so the farmer goes out in his field and he finds a leaf, and that leaf is all covered with bugs. The bugs here in this particular one, we're going to say they're all the same species. The colors here represent bugs with one type of allele, and then the red represents a bug with a different type of allele. They're all the same species of bug, however. So the farmer sprays the pesticide onto the leaf to kill these bugs. Well, after the pesticide application, 3 bugs are remaining, 2 white bugs remain, and one red bug remains. Now the white bugs, you noticed it killed most of the white bugs. Now these 2 white bugs, maybe they didn't get a high enough dose, maybe they were on the underside or the opposite side of the leaf, and so they didn't get a good spray, but for whatever reason they survived. The red one, of course, also survived, and the red one is the one with the allele for the resistance to the pesticide. So over time, the farmer, thinks, oh, well, the bugs are gone. Great. This is awesome. But when he comes back out a little while later, several generations later, he sees the leaf again and, oh gosh, it's covered with bugs again. But this time, The bugs that survived and reproduced after the application of the pesticide, now these bugs are becoming more resistant to the pesticide. So this time around, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 of the white bugs that are vulnerable or can be killed by the pesticide. But we also have, look at these, 4 red bugs that cannot be killed by the pesticide. So the farmer sprays the pesticide again. It kills most of the white bugs. One survives. You know, who knows what's the deal with that bug? Maybe again he didn't get a full dose, but all of the red bugs survive. So I want you to think, what would be your prediction if the farmer waits a little more time and then comes back and sees bugs on his plant? Are they going to be mostly red, mostly white? What's going to be your prediction about who's surviving to reproduce? So the alleles that allow these insects to survive and reproduce are then passed on to their offspring. These alleles also help the offspring survive the pesticide. So natural selection causes the frequency of the allele to increase in the population, and that allele is the pesticide resistance allele. Some of them are just naturally going to be resistant, and if those are the ones that survive and reproduce, then those are the whole population will eventually be immune or resistant to the pesticide. Eventually, the population changes until the pesticide is no longer effective at controlling the insect population. When this happens, the population has become resistant to the chemical. You're actually going to highlight everything on that slide. That's a key idea right there. Okay. Bacteria can also become resistant to antibiotics. Some bacteria have genes that allow them to survive antibiotic treatments. These bacteria reproduce and pass the genes on, and eventually the entire population is resistant to the drug. So bacteria, like all living things, have variations in their DNA, and because of that, when you take an antibiotic to kill bacteria, some of them just are naturally resistant to it, and they survive being, you trying to kill them off with an antibiotic. Well, those are the ones that are going to survive and reproduce. So eventually, the entire population of bacteria are not going to be able to be killed with the antibiotics. And this is actually a real problem. I don't know if you've ever heard of MRSA, M-R-S-A. You're going to hear more about it. This is one that's on the test. MRSA is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, and that is a bacteria. People who hang out in locker rooms often get this. It's staph, but it can't be killed easily with antibiotics, and people get really, really sick from it. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about natural selection and diversity. So this is an idea that we have already talked about when we talked about ecosystems and we talked about food webs. Every ecosystem contains a finite amount of resources. Some ecosystems can support large amounts of life, but even the most fertile ecosystems have limits. The largest population that an ecosystem can support is the population's carrying capacity, and that's a definition that you will have to provide on your notes. Populations tend to produce more offspring than the ecosystem can support. This may seem harmful, but it actually helps to drive natural selection. And you've seen this graph lots of times before, so we're going to look at it again. This is a carrying capacity and population growth graph. So the population is growing, right? They reach carrying capacity right there, but then they overshoot that, and the population grows higher than it needs to. That area right there, the last time we got together, I told you that's called overshoot. Well, that means that not all of the organisms are going to have enough of the limited resource to survive. So the ones that that are not the best competitors, that don't have the best alleles, they're going to die off. And so this area right here is called dieback. So we've got our overshoot and our dieback, where the organisms that are not the best adapted, they're going to die because there's not enough resources for all of the population. When a population exceeds its carrying capacity, the organisms with the best adaptations are most likely to survive and reproduce. And that's the idea that I just explained on the previous slide. So this idea that your genes and the people or the animals with the best adaptations that are most fit to their environment are going to be the ones that can get those limited resources the best. And when they do, they can survive and reproduce. This helps increase the frequency of the beneficial alleles within the population. If two populations become separated, they may be forced to adapt to different environments. So before I go any further, take a look down here. So we've got a population of insects. And you can see that they're varying shades of brown. Some are dark brown, some are medium brown, and some are light brown. And again, that's just natural variation within a population of the same species. Well, something happens, maybe there's a flood, and the single population becomes separated by a barrier that they cannot cross. In this case, it's a water barrier. So which organisms got to be on this side of the barrier and which organisms ended up on this side of the barrier is completely random. They didn't choose to go to one side or the other. They just got separated by a random environmental chance occurrence. So over time, the organisms that are on this side, they breed with each other and they create a population that looks like this. And then over time, these organisms breed with each other and they create a population that looks like this. And you can notice that this population up here has a different appearance than this population down here. And that is just a result of the random individuals that got separated on this side and the random individuals that got separated on that bottom side. The alleles that were in the top side led to a population that looks like this. And the alleles that ended up on the bottom side led to a population that looks like this. So as time goes further and further on, even if the barrier is removed, these populations may become so different that they can no longer interbreed. Mutations may also introduce new alleles into one population that are not present in the other. Okay, that's another way. So two ways that populations may become different. The first is an environmental barrier. They get separated. The second is mutations. Over time, natural selection will increase the diversity that's found within a species. And this is, of course, down here what we just talked about. This separation here created two populations from one. And a mutation, notice that there's no green bugs. See the brown bugs here and the brown bugs here? Do you see any green bugs? Nope. But there was a mutation that created a green bug in this population. And that green bug, for whatever reason, look, was apparently better adapted. How do I know? Well, because over time, all of the bugs in that population became green. So what happened to the brown ones? Well, they must have died out for some reason. So we can make some inferences about what that ecosystem might have looked like. I can think, maybe they were in a forest, and forests tend to be green. So green bugs in a green forest would be better adapted than brown bugs in a green forest. For whatever reason, the green bugs were better adapted to the environment and they survived to reproduce. Now down here, the resulting population looks pretty similar to this one, although it looks like the darker members have died out and you've got the lighter lighter brown members there. So again, they are better adapted to whatever environment they're in. But you can see that the environments are not the same because the populations are different colors. As long as the members of two populations continue to interbreed, they're considered part of the same species. A species contains all of the organisms that reproduce and create fertile offspring. So the reproduction there goes back to this word interbreeding. So take a look at these pictures here. While the spiders down there look very different, they are actually all part of the same species and they can reproduce with one another. So it's not just like appearance. I don't know much about spiders, but if you take a look here, I wouldn't be able to tell you all those spiders were from the same species. They all look very different to me. But they are all members of the same species, and the definition of species is that they can all interbreed and create fertile offspring. Sometimes two populations become adapted to very different environmental conditions, like our example with the insects, with the bugs that get separated by the river. And the variations within the populations will cause them to be able to no longer interbreed. When this happens, the two populations are considered different species. So two populations become adapted to different environmental conditions. The variations within the populations cause them to be able to no longer interbreed. We consider them at that point different species. Now, think about the spiders that I showed you on the last slide. I wouldn't be able to tell that those spiders were the same species, although someone who knows about spiders would. Now, these two little guys right here, Harris's antelope squirrel and the white-tailed antelope squirrel, those look very similar to me. I wouldn't be able to tell them apart because I'm not a antelope squirrel expert either. But these were originally part of the same species, an ancestral species. They live in the Grand Canyon, and as you can see, the Grand Canyon is bisected by the Colorado River. So this original ancestral species got separated into two populations that were separated by the river. The river was a barrier that the squirrels could not cross, and so over time they evolved into two separate species from the original one. When a new species is formed, it is called speciation. So that process is called speciation. Speciation is usually the result of populations becoming adapted to different environmental conditions. You're going to have lots of these different examples. This is a bird, right? This bird gets blown out to an island just randomly during a storm. We call that the founder species. And over time, the bird is adapting to the different environmental conditions on the island. The beak of the bird has to adapt in order to eat what's available on the island. And you can see that each of these birds has a slightly different beak. They're all adapted from this founder species. And each of these birds, the beak has evolved to eat something that is present on the island that they're populating. And we're going to talk more about that right now. So finches are a type of bird in the Galapagos Islands. And this is actually, this little example is what we call Darwin's finches, like Charles Darwin. Because the islands are close enough for the birds to reach, small populations of finches migrated to the new islands. However, each island had slightly different resources. So the larger islands had more niches that the birds could fill, and the smaller islands, of course, probably had less available food sources and less niches. Each of those islands was kind of unique and had different food sources and different niches. Different types of seeds and insects made different alleles more favorable based on the niches each population filled on an island. So again, remember, this is one type of finch that migrated out to an island, but the islands all have these different types of seeds and foods, so the birds are having to adapt their bodies to fit the food source. Again, different types of seeds and insects made different alleles more favorable based on the niche each population filled on an island. Because each population faced different environmental conditions and filled different niches, natural selection favored different alleles for the size of the bird and the beak shape, depending on the niche it was filling on the different island. And again, these birds were all descended from a single finch species. Now they're all different species because they adapted to the different environments, but at one time they were all a single species. Over time, the variations between finch populations increased as each population became more adapted to its island. And I've said that about 1 billion times today. Natural selection increased the diversity because different alleles helped these finches survive and reproduce. Hey, there's those two important words again. Again, survival and reproduction is the name of the game when it comes to the animal kingdom, and so anything that's going to help them survive and reproduce is going to be better adapted to the environment. Each population became so adapted to its niche that today none of these populations can interbreed. Each population of finch is now considered to be its own species. But remember, they came from a single ancestor. The formation of these new species is what we call speciation. All right, thanks for paying attention. Thanks for highlighting what you were supposed to. Now you're able to go back and fill in your notes. You can also use this video if you want to help you fill in the notes.